The first rays of morning sun peeked through the tall windows of Westfield Music Academy, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The grand hallway stood empty at this early hour except for one person. Li Wei moved silently through the building, her cleaning cart squeaking slightly as she pushed it from room to room. She was 52 years old with streaks of gray running through her dark hair that she always kept neatly tied back in a simple bun. Her hands, though small, were strong from years of work, and her eyes held a quiet patience that few ever noticed. For 8 years, Li Wei had been cleaning the prestigious music academy, arriving before dawn and leaving after most students had gone home. The fancy building with its soaring ceilings and beautiful artwork was a far cry from the tiny apartment she called home, where she lived alone with just a few treasured photographs and a small potted plant by the window. She had come to America from a small town in China nearly 2 decades ago. Back then, her dreams had been as big as the ocean she crossed. Now, those dreams sat quietly in the corner of her heart, covered by the dust of everyday survival and the responsibility of sending money back home to help her aging parents and her brother's family. "Good morning, Ms. Li," called out the security guard as she signed in at the front desk. He was one of the few people who regularly acknowledged her presence. "Good morning, Tom," she replied with a small smile, her accent still thick despite her years in the country. She appreciated how he always looked her in the eye when speaking to her, unlike many others who seemed to look through her as if she were as invisible as the dust she cleaned away. Li Wei started her routine in the practice rooms, where students would soon arrive to fill the building with music. She loved this part of her job the most, the quiet moments before the chaos of the day, when she could imagine the beautiful sounds that would soon fill these spaces. Sometimes, when she was sure no one was around, she would pause by a particularly beautiful piano, her fingers hovering inches above the keys, never touching but remembering. As she cleaned the grand practice room on the second floor, she noticed a flyer on the bulletin board. "Annual Spring Fundraising Gala," it announced in fancy lettering. This Saturday evening. The room would be filled with important people, wealthy donors, accomplished musicians, and the school's elite students and faculty. Li Wei would be there too, but not as a guest. She had been asked to work extra hours that night, helping in the kitchen and cleaning up afterward. She didn't mind the extra work. The overtime pay would help with this month's rent, which had gone up again. Besides, sometimes during these events she could stand in the shadows and listen to the performances. The music always transported her to another time and place, a life she once knew. By mid-morning, the halls were bustling with activity. Students rushed between classes, instrument cases bumping against their legs. Teachers strode purposefully, carrying stacks of sheet music. Li Wei made herself small, pressing against walls to let others pass, becoming part of the background like the paintings that hung on the walls. "Watch it," snapped a young man as he nearly collided with her cart. He didn't wait for a response, continuing down the hall without a backward glance. Li Wei simply nodded and continued her work, used to such encounters. The students at Westfield came from wealthy families. Many had never known what it meant to clean their own rooms, let alone someone else's, around lunchtime. Li Wei took her break in a small storage closet that had been converted into a break room for maintenance staff. She sat alone, eating the simple lunch she had packed, rice with vegetables and a small piece of chicken. From her bag, she pulled out a worn photograph. In it, a younger version of herself sat at a piano, her posture perfect, her face serious but with a hint of pride in her eyes. "Hey Li, you working the gala this weekend?" asked Jorge, one of the maintenance workers, as he entered the room. She tucked the photo away quickly. "Yes, I work Saturday night. Me too. I hear they've got some fancy piano being donated. Some rich guy's collection piece." Jorge grabbed his lunch from the small refrigerator. "Probably costs more than what I make in 10 years. Li Wei nodded, her interest piqued. She loved seeing new instruments, especially pianos. Each one had its own character, its own voice. After lunch, she continued her rounds, moving to the faculty offices. Most teachers barely glanced up as she emptied their trash bins and wiped down surfaces. But one, an older man with kind eyes behind thick glasses, always made a point to thank her. "Thank you, Ms. Li," said Professor Chen, looking up from the stack of papers he was grading. "Oh, and I left some sheet music on the floor by accident. Please don't throw it away." "I will be careful," she assured him, gently picking up the scattered papers. As she straightened them, her eyes caught familiar notes. Chopin's Nocturne Op. 9, number 2. Her heart skipped a beat, memories flooding back. Do you like Chopin? Professor Chen asked, noticing her lingering gaze. Startled, Li Wei shook her head. I just clean, she said quickly, handing him the papers and hurrying to finish her work. But Professor Chen had seen something in her eyes, a flash of recognition and understanding that went beyond casual interest. He watched thoughtfully as she left his office, wondering about the woman who quietly kept their spaces clean. Later that afternoon, Li Wei was polishing the wooden banisters of the main staircase when she overheard two students talking excitedly about the upcoming gala. Did you hear about the Steinway they're bringing in? Said a girl with long blonde hair, her voice carrying across the hall. It's supposed to be this historic piece that belonged to some famous composer. Yeah, but Dad says it's basically worthless as an actual instrument, replied her friend. The soundboard is cracked and half the hammers are shot. It's just for show, no one can actually play it anymore. They're just displaying it before it gets fully restored. What a waste, said the blonde girl with a laugh. A piano that can't be played. Their voices faded as they walked away, but their words lingered in Li Wei's mind. A beautiful piano that couldn't share its music seemed deeply sad to her, like a bird with broken wings or a dancer with injured legs. Perhaps that was why she felt a strange kinship with the instrument. Beautiful things silenced by circumstance. The week passed quickly, each day a mirror of the one before. Li Wei cleaned, listened, and remained invisible. But her thoughts often returned to the piano that would be displayed at the gala, wondering what stories it could tell if its voice hadn't been silenced. On Saturday, she arrived at the academy earlier than usual. The building hummed with preparation. Florists arranging elaborate centerpieces, caterers setting up in the kitchen, technicians adjusting lights and sound equipment. Li Wei was assigned to help in the kitchen first, washing dishes and preparing serving trays. As evening approached, she caught glimpses of the main hall being transformed. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light reflecting off the polished floors. Round tables covered in crisp white linens dotted the space, each set with fine china and silverware. And there, at the front of the room on a slightly raised platform, stood the piano she had heard about. Even from a distance, Li Wei could see its beauty. The deep, rich wood gleamed under the lights, its curves elegant and inviting. Between trips to and from the kitchen, she found herself drawn to it, each time taking a slightly different path that allowed her a moment to admire the instrument from various angles. During one such detour, when the hall was momentarily empty of workers, Li Wei approached the piano. Up close it was even more magnificent. A Steinway Model D concert grand, its lid propped open to reveal the intricate inner workings. She knew without being told that this was an exceptional instrument, or at least it had been before time and damage had silenced it. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers lightly touching the cool ivory of a key. She didn't press down, knowing it would make no sound even if she did, according to what the students had said, but the contact sent a shiver through her, connecting her to all the hands that had played this piano before, to all the music it had once created. What are you doing? The sharp voice made Li Wei jump back guiltily. The event coordinator stood there, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed. The kitchen staff is not supposed to be in here yet. The guest will be arriving soon. I'm sorry, Li Wei murmured, bowing her head slightly. I was just looking. Well, look on your own time. We need those appetizer trays filled now. Li Wei nodded and hurried back to the kitchen, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. But the brief connection with the piano had awakened something in her, a longing she usually kept carefully buried. As the evening progressed and guests began to arrive, Li Wei moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres, her black and white uniform marking her as staff, someone to take food from but not to notice. The women wore glittering dresses and sparkling jewelry, while the men were dressed in tailored suits. They laughed and chatted, sipping champagne and discussing music in technical terms that Li Wei understood far better than anyone would have guessed. Throughout it all, her eyes kept returning to the piano, standing proudly but silently at the front of the room. Like her, it had a voice that no one present could hear. The gala was in full swing now. The main hall of Westfield Music Academy buzzed with conversation and laughter as waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Crystal glasses clinked, and the soft background music from a string quartet competed with the chatter of the well-dressed guests. Li Wei moved quietly among them, nearly invisible in her black and white uniform. She collected empty glasses and napkins, careful not to bump into anyone. The glamorous women in their silk dresses and the men in tailored tuxedos barely glanced her way as she worked. She was part of the background, like the potted plants decorating the corners of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," announced the Academy's director, Dr. Reynolds tapping a knife against his glass. The room gradually quieted. He was a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority that commanded respect. "Thank you all for coming tonight to support our talented students and our institution." Li Wei paused her work, standing still near the back wall. She knew she should continue clearing tables, but she wanted to hear about the piano. Her eyes drifted to the beautiful instrument at the front of the room, its polished wood gleaming under the chandeliers. "Tonight, we are honored to have a very special guest," Dr. Reynolds continued, gesturing to an elderly man seated at the table of honor. "Mr. Harold Whitman, one of our most generous benefactors, has donated a historic Steinway concert grand piano to our academy." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Mr. Whitman, thin and frail but with bright, alert eyes, nodded in acknowledgement. "This instrument," Dr. Reynolds went on, "once belonged to the renowned composer Richard Thornhill. Though it's no longer playable due to internal damage, it represents an important piece of musical history. After tonight, it will be fully restored by expert craftsmen and then permanently displayed in our main hall." Li Wei's heart sank a little at the confirmation that the piano truly couldn't be played. She had hoped the students she overheard had been mistaken. As Dr. Reynolds continued speaking about the Academy's achievements and future plans, Li Wei resumed her work. She collected used napkins and empty plates, always keeping her eyes lowered, always trying to blend into the shadows. Near the donated piano, a group of students had gathered. They were the elite of the Academy, talented, privileged young musicians who performed at special events and competitions. Li Wei recognized them from their photos on the student achievements wall she dusted each week. "It's such a shame no one can play it tonight," said a girl with copper-colored hair, running her fingers lightly over the piano's frame. "I would have loved to be the first to perform on it." "Apparently the soundboard is cracked," said a boy with glasses. "Even if you press the keys, most of them won't make any sound at all." Another student, taller than the others, with an air of casual arrogance, leaned against the piano. "My father says old man Whitman is just doing this for the tax write-off. The piano's practically worthless in its current state." Li Wei moved closer to their table, pretending to clean nearby while listening to their conversation. She couldn't help herself. Any talk about the piano drew her like a magnet. "Hey, check out the cleaning lady," said the tall boy suddenly, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. "She keeps staring at the piano. It's like she's never seen one before." Li Wei quickly looked away, but it was too late. The students had noticed her interest. "Maybe she wants to play it," said the copper-haired girl with a smirk. "Wouldn't that be a sight?" They laughed, and Li Wei felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. She should move away now, she thought. Return to the kitchen where she belonged. But something kept her feet rooted to the spot, and her eyes drifted back to the piano. "I have an idea," said the tall boy, his eyes lighting up with mischief. He lowered his voice, but Li Wei could still hear him. "Let's ask her to play something. It'll be hilarious." "Don't be mean, Ryan," said a quieter girl with dark braided hair. "I'm not being mean," Ryan protested. "The piano doesn't work anyway, so what's the harm? Besides, she keeps looking at it like she wants to touch it. We'd be doing her a favor?" The copper-haired girl giggled. "Oh my God, yes. Can you imagine? The look on everyone's faces when she sits down at a Steinway. Reynolds would have a fit," added the boy with glasses, looking both uncomfortable and amused. Ryan straightened up. "Watch this," he said confidently. He approached Li Wei, who immediately busied herself with wiping an already clean table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice suddenly polite and friendly. "I noticed you seem interested in the piano." Li Wei kept her eyes down. "I just clean," she said softly, her accent thickening with nervousness. "Well, we were wondering if you'd like to play something on it," Ryan continued. "Before it goes away for restoration. It's kind of a special occasion, and we thought—" He trailed off with a shrug. Li Wei looked up at him surprised. Was this young man actually inviting her to play? But no. She saw the barely concealed amusement in his eyes, heard the stifled laughter from his friends watching nearby. They were making fun of her. the cleaning lady who dared to admire something so far above her station. "No, thank you," she said quietly, turning away. "I need to work," but Ryan persisted. "Come on, just one song. What's your favorite piece? Chopsticks? Heart and soul?" His friends snickered at his patronizing tone. "The piano's going away tomorrow." This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Li Wei felt trapped. If she refused again, they would continue to mock her. If she agreed, she would embarrass herself by sitting at a broken piano that wouldn't make any sound. Either way, she would be the joke of the evening. Across the room, she caught the eye of Professor Chen, who had noticed the interaction and was watching with a concerned expression. For some reason, his presence gave her courage. She straightened her shoulders slightly. "It does not work," she said to Ryan, her voice a little stronger. "You said so yourself," Ryan grinned. "Oh, you can still press the keys. Some of them might make a sound. Don't you want to try?" By now, other guests had noticed the conversation. Curious glances were cast their way. Li Wei felt exposed, a spotlight suddenly shining on her when she'd spent years trying to remain unseen. "What's going on here?" Dr. Reynolds had approached, his eyebrows drawn together in confusion. "Nothing, sir," Ryan said smoothly. "We were just telling." He paused, realizing he didn't know the cleaning lady's name. "Li Wei," she supplied softly. "Yes, we were just telling Ms. Li that she should have the honor of being the first to play the historic piano," Ryan continued. "She seems very interested in it." Dr. Reynolds looked bewildered. He glanced from the students to Li Wei, who was clutching her cleaning cloth tightly, wishing she could disappear. "I don't think that would be appropriate," the director began. "The piano is not in playing condition and—" "But sir," interrupted the copper-haired girl, playing along, "isn't music for everyone?" "Isn't that what you always say in your speeches? That music transcends backgrounds and brings people together?" Dr. Reynolds looked caught off guard by having his own words used against him. Several nearby guests were watching now, waiting to see how he would respond. Mr. Whitman, the elderly donor, had wheeled himself over in his chair. "What's this about someone playing the piano?" he asked, his voice surprisingly strong for his frail appearance. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Harold," Dr. Reynolds said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." "The cleaning staff wanted to play your piano, sir," Ryan explained with feigned innocence. "We thought it might be nice, but Dr. Reynolds says it wouldn't be appropriate." Mr. Whitman's bushy eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" He turned to Li Wei, studying her with keen eyes. "Do you play, young lady?" All eyes were on her now. Li Wei felt her throat tighten. I used to," she admitted softly. "Long time ago." "Well, I don't see the harm," Mr. Whitman declared. "The piano can't be damaged any further than it already is. Let her try if she wants to." Dr. Reynolds looked as though he wanted to object but couldn't find the words to contradict his most important donor. Well, if you're sure, Harold." "I'm sure," the old man said firmly. "Music belongs to everyone, as your student so wisely pointed out." There was a twinkle in his eye that suggested he wasn't entirely fooled by the student's false sincerity. Li Wei found herself being ushered toward the piano by Ryan and his friends, who could barely contain their glee at the success of their prank. Whispers and curious murmurs followed her. She heard someone ask, "Is this part of the program?" And another reply, "I think it's some kind of diversity initiative." The crowd parted, creating a path to the beautiful Steinway. Li Wei wanted to run, to hide in the kitchen or the janitor's closet where she belonged. But something inside her, a long dormant spark of pride, perhaps, prevented her from fleeing. As she approached the piano, memories flooded back. The countless hours of practice in her childhood. The stern teachers who rapped her knuckles when she made mistakes. The joy of mastering difficult pieces. The applause at recitals, and later the music conservatory in Shanghai, where she had once been a promising student, before life took her down a different path. She stood before the piano now, aware of every eye in the room on her. The students who had orchestrated this humiliation were watching eagerly, waiting for her to embarrass herself. Dr. Reynolds looked uncomfortable. Professor Chen watched with curious intensity, and old Mr. Whitman leaned forward in his wheelchair, perhaps the only person genuinely interested in what might happen. Li Wei took a deep breath. She would sit down, press a few keys that would make no sound, and then excuse herself. She would get through this moment of humiliation with as much dignity as she could muster. Tomorrow she would return to being invisible. She carefully sat down on the bench, adjusting her plain black uniform. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning, hovered over the keys. She could feel the collective anticipation in the room, the barely suppressed laughter from Ryan and his friends. Li Wei closed her eyes. Whatever happened next, she would at least have this moment, sitting at a magnificent Steinway that had once been played by a great composer. She would add this to her collection of memories to be taken out and examined in private moments. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her skin. Then, taking another deep breath, she began to play. The room fell completely silent as Li Wei's fingers touched the keys. Even the students who had orchestrated this moment as a joke held their breath, waiting for the awkward silence of a broken piano or perhaps a few pitiful, discordant notes that would provide the punchline to their cruel prank. Li Wei herself expected nothing. She had heard the students say the piano couldn't be played, that the soundboard was cracked, that it was merely for display. Yet when her fingers pressed down on the first chord of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a sound emerged, soft and somewhat muffled, but unmistakably music. Her eyes flew open in surprise. The piano wasn't completely dead after all. Some of the notes responded, though others remained silent when pressed. It was like playing with missing teeth, gaps in what should have been a complete smile of sound. For a brief moment, Li Wei hesitated. Should she stop now? She had proven the piano could make some sound, which was more than anyone expected. She could stand up, bow politely, and retreat back to the shadows where she belonged. But the feel of the keys beneath her fingers awakened something long dormant inside her. How many years had it been since she had touched a real piano? The cheap electronic keyboard in her apartment was a poor substitute for this magnificent instrument, broken though it might be. She made a split-second decision. Instead of stopping, she adjusted. She began to work around the dead keys, modifying the piece on the fly to accommodate the piano's limitations. When a note failed to sound, she found another that worked, transposing and adapting the music as she went. Her hands moved with growing confidence, coaxing a haunting, imperfect but beautiful rendition of Chopin from the supposedly unplayable piano. Around the room, expressions changed from amusement to confusion, then to astonishment. Ryan's smug smile faltered. The copper-haired girl's mouth fell open slightly. Professor Chen leaned forward, his eyes wide with recognition of what he was witnessing. And old Mr. Whitman sat perfectly still, his gnarled hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Li Wei was no longer in the grand hall of Westfield Music Academy. In her mind, she was back in Shanghai, 20 years younger, practicing for hours in a small room at the conservatory. She remembered her teacher, Mrs. Zhao, standing over her with a wooden ruler, tapping out the rhythm on the edge of the piano. Again, Mrs. Zhao would say, "Your hands must speak what your heart feels." The music flowed from her now, not perfect but honest. The Nocturne was a piece about night, about dreams and gentle darkness, and Li Wei played it as someone who knew both beauty and sorrow. Her rough hands, marked by years of manual labor, moved with a grace and precision that told their own story, talent buried but not destroyed by circumstance. As she reached the middle section of the piece, she encountered more dead keys. Without missing a beat, she transitioned to a different Chopin piece in a key that worked better with the piano's limitations, the Raindrop Prelude. The seamless shift from one piece to another drew a small gasp from someone in the audience who recognized the masterful improvisation. Throughout the room, people who had been holding drinks or engaged in whispered conversations now stood transfixed. Waiters paused in their service. The event photographer, who had been capturing candid shots of wealthy donors, now turned his camera toward the unexpected performer in her simple black and white uniform. The students who had planned the prank stood in a tight cluster, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dismay. This wasn't supposed to happen. The cleaning lady was supposed to press a few keys, hear nothing, and slink away embarrassed while they laughed behind their hands. Instead, she was giving what might be the most memorable performance of the evening. Dr. Reynolds watched with his mouth slightly open, occasionally glancing at the guests to gauge their reactions. He seemed torn between concern about the break in protocol and amazement at what was unfolding. Only Professor Chen seemed unsurprised, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Perhaps he had sensed something in Li Wei all along, in the way she had looked at the sheet music in his office, or how she moved with a dancer's awareness of her body, despite her humble role. Li Wei remained lost in the music, her eyes half closed as she worked around the piano's limitations. She found that the middle register was most responsive, while the highest and lowest notes were often silent. It was like having a conversation with someone who could only speak certain words. The challenge of it awakened her creativity, forcing her to find new paths through familiar musical landscapes. As she played, the weight of her daily life, the early mornings, the aching back, the invisibility, seemed to lift from her shoulders. For these few minutes, she was not a cleaning woman. She was simply a musician, speaking through her hands the language she had once been fluent in. The raindrop prelude built to its dramatic middle section, where the repeated A-flat notes fell like persistent raindrops against the melody. Li Wei leaned into the music, her body swaying slightly as the emotional intensity grew. When she reached the return of the main theme, several of the needed notes failed to sound, but she had anticipated this and shifted to a lower octave where the keys still worked. The adaptation was so smooth that only the most trained ears would notice it wasn't played as written. To everyone else, it simply sounded like a passionate interpretation of a beloved piece. In the audience, an older woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. A young student violinist stood with her mouth slightly open, watching Li Wei's hands with professional appreciation. Mr. Whitman leaned toward Dr. Reynolds and whispered something that made the director's eyebrows rise even higher. As Li Wei brought the piece to its gentle conclusion, a profound silence fell over the room. For several heartbeats, no one moved or spoke. It was as if they collectively held their breath, suspended in the moment between the final note and whatever would come next. Li Wei herself sat motionless, her hands still resting lightly on the keys. She was afraid to look up, afraid to break the spell that had allowed her for these few minutes to become her true self again. But slowly she raised her eyes. What she saw stunned her more than anything that had happened so far. The entire room was looking at her, not through her or past her as they usually did, but directly at her, with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to confusion. And then, from the back of the room, someone began to applaud. It was Professor Chen standing now, his hands coming together in a slow, deliberate clap. Next to him, the elderly Mr. Whitman joined in from his wheelchair, his thin hands making a surprisingly strong sound. One by one, others joined the applause, until the entire room was filled with the sound of clapping hands and murmurs of appreciation. Someone whistled. A young student called out, "Bravo!" The copper-haired girl who had been part of the prank looked at her friends with a stunned expression, as if to say, "Did you know she could do that?" Li Wei sat frozen on the bench, overwhelmed by the attention. This was not part of her carefully constructed life, where she moved quietly through the world, noticed by few and remembered by fewer. She didn't know how to respond to applause or how to accept being the center of attention. Dr. Reynolds approached the piano, his professional smile back in place, though his eyes were still wide with surprise. "That was unexpected," he said, offering his hand to help her rise from the bench. "Thank you, Ms." He trailed off, realizing again that he didn't know her full name despite her years of service at his school. "Li," she said softly. "Li Wei." "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Reynolds announced, recovering his composure. "Ms. Li Wei, a member of our maintenance staff." He gestured toward her as if she had been a planned part of the evening's entertainment all along. The applause continued, and Li Wei managed a small awkward bow. She wanted nothing more than to return to the kitchen, to the familiar safety of her invisibility. But as she tried to step away from the piano, Mr. Whitman wheeled himself forward. "Young lady," he said, his voice cracking with age but his eyes sharp and clear. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The room quieted, everyone eager to hear her answer. Li Wei felt her cheeks grow warm under the scrutiny of so many eyes. "Shanghai Conservatory," she said simply. "Long time ago." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Shanghai Conservatory of Music was one of the most prestigious music schools in Asia. Students who trained there often went on to international careers as performers or composers, and yet you're working as cleaning staff here? Mr. Whitman pressed, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in confusion. Li Wei looked down at her hands, the hands that had just drawn such beauty from a broken instrument. Life. Takes unexpected turns, she said quietly. Professor Chen stepped forward. I think what we just witnessed was extraordinary, he said. Not just the technical skill, which was impressive enough, but the musicality, the ability to adapt to the piano's limitations and still create something beautiful. That kind of musical intelligence is rare. More murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Liwei stood uncomfortably under their gaze, wishing she could disappear. This attention, this recognition, it stirred up too many feelings, too many memories of dreams she had carefully packed away. Ryan, the tall student who had started the prank, stood slightly apart from his friends now. He looked confused, as if the script he thought they were following had suddenly been replaced with something entirely different. The joke had backfired spectacularly, revealing not a clueless cleaning woman but an artist of considerable talent. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. Well, this has certainly been a unique addition to our evening. Now, if we could proceed with— Wait, interrupted Mr. Whitman. The old man's voice carried surprising authority despite his frail appearance. I have a question for Ms. Li. All eyes turned back to Li Wei, who wished the floor would open up and swallow her. Mr. Whitman studied Li Wei with eyes that had seen nearly 9 decades of life. His wrinkled face was serious, but there was kindness in his expression as he asked, Why aren't you playing professionally? Or at least teaching? The question hung in the air. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. Li Wei felt her throat tighten. How could she possibly explain the complicated path her life had taken in a way these people would understand? It's a long story, she said softly. I think we would all like to hear it, Mr. Whitman replied, his voice gentle but firm. He gestured to a nearby chair. Please sit down. You've been standing all evening. Li Wei glanced toward the kitchen doors where the catering manager was watching with a frown. She was supposed to be working, not sitting with the guests. Professor Chen noticed her concern. I'll speak with the staff, he said quietly, and walked over to the catering manager. After a brief conversation, he returned with a nod. It's fine. Take a moment. Hesitantly, Li Wei sat down in the offered chair, feeling strange to be seated while so many still stood around her. She smoothed her uniform nervously, aware of how out of place she looked among the evening gowns and tuxedos. I came to America 20 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was 28 years old. As she spoke, the crowd around her grew quieter, straining to hear her words. Dr. Reynolds motioned for a microphone, but Mr. Whitman waved him off, not wanting to intimidate her further. Before that, I studied piano since I was 5 years old, Li Wei continued, gaining a little confidence. My father was a music professor, very strict. 3 hours practice every day, even when I was very young. She paused, remembering those early years, the small apartment in Shanghai, the upright piano that took up half their living room, the metronome ticking endlessly as she repeated scales and arpeggios until her small fingers ached. I was accepted to Shanghai Conservatory at 16. My father was very proud. A small smile touched her lips at the memory. I studied there for 6 years. My teachers said I could have a career as a concert pianist. What happened? Asked a woman near the front, unable to contain her curiosity. Li Wei's eyes grew distant. My father became ill, lung cancer. My mother had died when I was young, so there was no one else to care for him. I left school to be with him. Used my savings for his treatments. The room was completely silent now. Even the waitstaff had paused to listen. After he died, I needed money. My cousin had moved to America and said I could find work here. I planned to save enough to return to music someday. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had just played Chopin with such feeling. But life, it moves in different directions than we plan. How so? Mr. Whitman prompted gently. Li Wei took a deep breath. First I worked in a restaurant washing dishes. Then I cleaned houses for a company. The pay was little, and living here is expensive. I sent money home to help my brother's family after he lost his job. Then I helped my cousin when her husband left her with 2 small children. She shrugged slightly. Years passed. I got older. A concert career. It became a dream from another life. Professor Chen, who had been listening intently, asked, But surely you could have taught piano. With your training, Li Wei shook her head. Who would hire me? My English was poor. My diploma and certificates were in Chinese. I had no connections, no references here, and I needed steady work, not something uncertain. The copper-haired girl who had been part of the prank stepped forward hesitantly. "Don't you have a piano at home?" she asked, sounding genuinely curious now rather than mocking. "A small keyboard," Li Wei replied. "Not the same, but it helps me remember." She didn't add that she could only play it late at night with headphones, so as not to disturb her neighbors in the thin-walled apartment building. "And you've been working here for?" Dr. Reynolds asked, looking slightly ashamed that he didn't know. 8 years, Li Wei said simply. 8 years of mopping these floors, dusting these surfaces, emptying these trash bins. 8 years of walking past practice rooms filled with music, of glimpsing talented young students who took for granted the opportunities she had lost. 8 years of invisibility. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Many of the guests looked embarrassed, perhaps realizing for the first time that the woman who cleaned up after them had once been a promising artist herself. Others seemed moved by her story. A few looked skeptical, as if they couldn't quite believe that someone with her talent had ended up cleaning floors. Mr. Whitman broke the silence. "The piano you just played, my Steinway, it belonged to my teacher, Richard Thornhill. He once told me something I never forgot. He said that true musicians don't just play the notes, they find the music even in broken instruments." The old man's eyes were bright with emotion. "That's exactly what you did tonight, Ms. Lee. You found the music in a broken piano. I haven't heard anyone play with that kind of understanding in many years." Li Wei felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "Thank you," she said softly. "It is a beautiful instrument, even with its problems." "Indeed it is," Mr. Whitman agreed. "And it's found the right hands tonight." He turned to Dr. Reynolds. "William, I'd like to make some changes to my donation arrangement." Dr. Reynolds looked startled. "Changes? But everything's been signed." "It's my piano and my money," Mr. Whitman interrupted firmly. "I can change my mind if I wish." He turned back to Li Wei. "Do you teach at all, Ms. Lee? Privately, perhaps?" She shook her head. "No, just clean. But you could teach with your background?" I suppose I could," she said uncertainly. "But, William," Mr. Whitman addressed the director again, "instead of putting the piano on display after restoration, I want it to be used for teaching. And I want Ms. Lee to be offered a position in your community outreach program, teaching piano to students who can't afford regular lessons." A murmur ran through the crowd. Dr. Reynolds looked as if he'd been asked to swallow something unpleasant. "Harold, while that's a generous thought, there are considerations, qualifications, paperwork, our existing faculty. I'm sure you can figure it out," Mr. Whitman said dismissively. "Unless you don't want the rest of my planned donation for the new recital hall?" Dr. Reynolds' face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling into a forced smile. "Of course, we can certainly look into possibilities for Ms. Lee. Perhaps a special consultant role or a teacher," Mr. Whitman insisted. "And not buried in some basement room. She should teach in the main building where everyone can see and hear her students' progress." Li Wei sat in shocked silence. Was this really happening? After 20 years of setting aside her dreams, was this wealthy old man actually offering her a way back to music? I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll consider it," Mr. Whitman replied. "The decision is yours, of course, but I think you were meant to play that piano tonight. Some might call it coincidence. I call it fate." Professor Chen stepped forward. "I would be happy to help Ms. Lee with any certification or paperwork she might need," he offered. "And I believe she would be an invaluable addition to our outreach program." Dr. Reynolds, seeing which way the wind was blowing, nodded with more enthusiasm than he probably felt. "Yes, certainly. We can discuss details after the gala. For now, let's allow Ms. Lee to return to her duties." He clearly hoped to end this unexpected interruption to his carefully planned evening. But Mr. Whitman wasn't finished. "One more thing," he said. "I'd like to hear another piece before we move on." He looked at Li Wei. "If you're willing?" All eyes turned to her again. Li Wei felt overwhelmed by the attention, by the sudden turn her life had taken in the space of 15 minutes. But the thought of playing again, of letting her fingers speak the language they had been silent in for so long, filled her with a joy she had almost forgotten. "I would be honored," she said, rising from her chair with new confidence. As she walked back to the piano, she was aware of the changed way people looked at her, no longer invisible, no longer just part of the background. The students who had planned to humiliate her now watched with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Ryan caught her eye and gave a small, shame-faced nod that might have been an apology. Li Wei sat down at the bench again, taking a moment to center herself. What should she play? Something that would work with the piano's limitations, but also something that expressed what she was feeling in this moment of unexpected transformation. She decided on Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece about moonlight and its gentle revelation of beauty that might otherwise remain hidden in darkness. As her fingers found the opening chords adjusting for the piano's dead keys, she felt a sense of coming home after a long, long journey. The room fell silent once more as the ethereal music filled the air. Li Wei played with her eyes closed, letting the familiar notes wash over her. She had practiced this piece hundreds of times in her youth, but never had it felt so meaningful, so personal as it did tonight. As the final notes faded away, she opened her eyes to see several people wiping away tears. Mr. Whitman sat with his eyes closed, a peaceful expression on his lined face. Even Dr. Reynolds looked moved despite his earlier discomfort. The applause this time was immediate and heartfelt. Li Wei rose and bowed deeply, the way she had been taught at the conservatory so many years ago. In that moment, standing before a room full of people who now saw her, truly saw her, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Pride. After the applause died down, she slipped back toward the kitchen, needing a moment alone to process everything that had happened. As she pushed through the swinging door, away from the curious eyes and well-meaning questions, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. A cooking assistant looked at her curiously. "You okay?" Li Wei nodded, unable to find words to explain the earthquake that had just shaken her carefully constructed life. How could she possibly describe what it felt like to be invisible for 20 years and then suddenly seen? To have dreams buried for so long suddenly unearthed and held up to the light? She looked down at her hands that had scrubbed floors and washed dishes and dusted countless surfaces. Hands that had just played Chopin and Debussy on a Steinway grand piano to a room full of applause. "I am okay," she said finally with a small smile. "I think I am more than okay." 3 months had passed since the night of the gala. Spring had given way to summer, bringing warm sunshine that streamed through the tall windows of Westfield Music Academy. In one of those sunbeams, Li Wei sat at a piano, not the broken Steinway from the gala, but a new one that had been installed in what was now her teaching studio. The room had once been a storage space for old music stands and chairs, tucked away on the first floor of the academy. Now it had been transformed with fresh paint, proper lighting, and a beautiful sign on the door that read, "Community Music Program, Li Wei, Instructor." Inside, alongside the new piano, were comfortable chairs, bookshelves filled with sheet music, and colorful posters showing musical notes and terms in both English and Chinese. Li Wei ran her fingers lightly over the keys, savoring the perfect action of each one. Unlike the broken piano at the gala, this instrument responded to her touch exactly as it should, every note clear and true. Mr. Whitman had insisted on donating this new piano specifically for her use, separate from his restoration of the historic Steinway. That was still ongoing. The clock on the wall showed 3:45. Her next student would arrive in 15 minutes, a 12-year-old boy from the local middle school who had shown remarkable talent but whose family could never have afforded the academy's regular tuition. He was one of 15 students now enrolled in the community program that Li Wei oversaw, teaching children from backgrounds similar to her own. The path from that night to this moment had not been entirely smooth. Dr. Reynolds had dragged his feet initially, suggesting further evaluation of Li Wei's qualifications and raising concerns about her lack of teaching experience in America. But Mr. Whitman had been true to his word, making it clear that his substantial donation to the new recital hall would depend on Li Wei being given a real opportunity. Professor Chen had been her strongest ally, helping her navigate the paperwork, translating her Chinese credentials, and even inviting her to observe his own classes until she felt comfortable teaching again. He had become a friend, the first real one she'd had since coming to America. Li Wei smiled as she remembered their conversation just last week. "You know," Professor Chen had said as they shared tea in the faculty lounge, "when I first noticed you looking at that Chopin sheet music in my office months ago, I suspected you might be more than just the cleaning staff. But I never imagined That I would be sitting here as your colleague? Li Wei had finished for him, still getting used to the idea herself. Life takes unexpected turns, he had replied, echoing her own words from the night of the gala. A knock at the door brought Li Wei back to the present. She glanced at the clock, still 10 minutes before her next lesson. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal Ryan, the tall student who had initiated the prank at the gala. He looked different now, less arrogant, more uncertain. He had been avoiding her for weeks, taking complicated routes through the academy to prevent crossing her path. This was the first time they had been face to face since that night. "Ms. Li," he said, hovering in the doorway. "Can I speak with you for a minute?" She nodded, gesturing to one of the chairs across from her. "Of course." Ryan sat down awkwardly, his long legs folding like a grasshopper's. He stared at his hands for a moment before looking up. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "What I did at the gala, it was mean and stupid. I'm really sorry." Li Wei studied him thoughtfully. In her first weeks as a teacher, she had heard whispers about Ryan, that he came from enormous wealth, that his parents were rarely present in his life, that his arrogance masked deep insecurity about his own musical abilities. "Thank you for your apology," she said simply. Ryan looked surprised, perhaps expecting anger or a lecture. "That's it? You're not mad?" Li Wei smiled slightly. "What would be the point of anger now? What happened that night changed my life for the better. Yeah, but still. We were trying to embarrass you. We thought it would be funny to watch you sit at a broken piano and not know what to do." He looked genuinely ashamed now. "It was cruel." "Yes," Li Wei agreed, "it was. But sometimes cruel intentions can lead to unexpected outcomes." She gestured around the studio. "Look what came from it." Ryan nodded slowly. "I still feel terrible." "Good," Li Wei said, her voice gentle but firm. "That feeling will remind you to be kinder next time." She paused, then added, "I have heard you play, you know. Last month's student recital. You performed Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata." Ryan looked surprised again. "You were there?" "I was. You have talent, but you rush the difficult passages. You are afraid of making mistakes, so you hurry past the challenging parts instead of moving through them with confidence." The young man blinked, taken aback by her direct assessment. That's exactly what my regular teacher says." "I also noticed something else," Li Wei continued. "When you play the slow emotional sections, you hold back. It's as if you're afraid to show too much feeling." Ryan looked down again. "My father says emotion is weakness," he said quietly. Li Wei nodded, understanding more about him now. "In life, perhaps some people think this way. But in music, emotion is everything. Without it, we are just pressing keys in the correct order." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Ryan asked, "Do you think I could, maybe, take some lessons with you? Not to replace my regular teacher, but just sometimes?" It was Li Wei's turn to be surprised. "You want to learn from me? The way you played that night, even on a broken piano." Ryan shook his head in wonder. "I've never heard anyone play like that. You made the music sound like it was speaking directly to each person in the room." Li Wei considered his request. Part of her wanted to refuse. This was the boy who had tried to humiliate her after all. But the larger part, the part that had dedicated her life to music before circumstances intervened, recognized a student who needed guidance. "Tuesday afternoons, 4 o'clock, she said finally, "after my community students. But I warn you, I trained in the Chinese tradition. Very demanding, very precise." A genuine smile spread across Ryan's face. "Thank you, Ms. Li, I'll be here." He stood to leave, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something? How did you do it that night? How did you make that broken piano sound so beautiful?" Li Wei thought for a moment. "When I was a student in Shanghai, my teacher once made me practice on a piano with several broken keys. For weeks I had to work around the dead notes, finding new fingerings, different approaches." She smiled at the memory. "I hated it at the time, but she was teaching me something important. Music is not just in the instrument. It is in the musician. If you have music in your heart, you can find a way to let it out, even when the path is blocked." Ryan nodded slowly, seeming to absorb her words. "I'll see you Tuesday," he said, and left with a respectful nod that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. Alone again, Li Wei turned back to the piano. Her life had transformed so completely in such a short time that sometimes she still couldn't believe it. She no longer arrived at the academy before dawn to clean. Instead, she came in the afternoon to teach. Her hands, once rough from cleaning chemicals, were softening again, returning to a pianist's hands. She had kept her small apartment but had splurged on one luxury, a better keyboard with weighted keys that felt more like a real piano. At night, she could now practice without headphones. Her neighbors, far from complaining about the noise, often left their doors ajar to listen. A week after the gala, something else unexpected had happened. Someone had uploaded a shaky cell phone video of her performance to the internet. Within days, it had spread widely, accompanied by headlines like, "Cleaning Woman Stuns Elite Music Academy" and "Hidden Talent Discovered After Cruel Prank." Li Wei had been shocked to see her private moment shared with the world, but the video had brought unexpected opportunities, offers for interviews, invitations to perform, even interest from recording companies. She had declined most of these, preferring to focus on rebuilding her skills and her new teaching career. But she had accepted one invitation, to perform at a benefit concert for music education in underserved communities. The event was still 2 months away, and she practiced diligently each night, slowly regaining the technical proficiency that had once been second nature. The door opened again, and this time it was her student, a bright-eyed boy named Tao, clutching his music books. "Ms. Li," he exclaimed, "I practiced every day this week, even on Saturday when my mom said I could take a break." "That's wonderful, Tao," she said, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This, the eager shine in a student's eyes, the joy of passing on knowledge, was something she had never expected to experience again. As they began the lesson, working through scales and then a simple Mozart piece, Li Wei felt a deep sense of rightness. Teaching came naturally to her, drawing on both her conservatory training and her life experiences. She knew how to be strict without being harsh, how to correct without discouraging, how to recognize each student's unique gifts and challenges. An hour later, as Tao packed up his books, the door opened once more. Professor Chen peeked in, accompanied by an elderly man in a wheelchair, Mr. Whitman. "Hope we're not interrupting," Professor Chen said. Harold wanted to see how things were going with the new piano. "It's wonderful," Li Wei assured them. "Perfect in every way." Tao looked curiously at Mr. Whitman. "Are you the man who gave Ms. Li the piano?" "She told us about you," Mr. Whitman smiled. "And what did she tell you?" "That you heard her play on a broken piano and knew she was supposed to be a teacher instead of a cleaner," Tao said matter-of-factly. "And that sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them," Mr. Whitman chuckled. "That's a fair summary." He turned to Li Wei. "I came to share some news. The restoration of the Steinway is nearly complete. They've done remarkable work. It will be better than new while preserving its historical character." "That's wonderful," Li Wei said. "It deserves to sing again." "Indeed," Mr. Whitman agreed. "And I'd like you to be the first to play it when it returns next month. A small recital, nothing too formal. What do you say?" Li Wei felt a flutter of both excitement and nervousness. "I would be honored." After they left, Li Wei remained at the piano, running through a piece she was preparing for the upcoming benefit concert. As her fingers moved across the keys, she thought about the strange, winding path her life had taken. 20 years of dreams deferred. 20 years of invisibility. And then, in a single night, everything had changed because of a broken piano and a prank gone wrong. Outside her studio window, she could see the academy's garden, where students often gathered between lessons. The copper-haired girl who had been part of the prank was there, laughing with friends. When she noticed Li Wei watching, she gave a small, respectful wave. Li Wei waved back, then returned to her music. The past could not be changed, and those years of cleaning floors and emptying trash bins could never be recovered. But they had given her something valuable: perspective, humility, appreciation for second chances. As the last light of afternoon filled her studio with golden warmth, Li Wei played on, her music flowing out through the open window into the summer air. No longer invisible, no longer silent, she had found her voice again, and it was stronger, deeper, and more beautiful than before.